Right now in Sudan, anarchist comrades are organizing in the middle of a war, repression, and displacement. The anarchist group in Sudan is building mutual aid, grassroots committees, and political education for survival and liberation. And they need our support. You can stand with them by making a one-time donation, holding your own fundraiser and sending the funds to the Open Collective, Support Sudanese Comrades, link in bio, or become a monthly supporter at that same Open Collective link. Every contribution strengthens their ability to keep resisting and caring for their people. Solidarity means action. Tap the link in our bio or in the show notes and support the anarchist group in Sudan today. What was the young Elia like?
Quite the introvert. I grew up in Lebanon, in a pretty small village. Went to 3 different schools because I was not a good student, according to the teachers, and didn't enjoy that experience at all. So I would say like a good chunk of my childhood has not been fun, mostly due to schooling. But besides that, when I was at home, I was mostly free to do as I please, and that meant kind of losing myself in books and movies and whatnot, a habit that I still have, I'd say.
What kind of formative experiences growing up do you feel like have shaped some of your consciousness, like politically, morally, materially?
I got into anarchism at a young age, which in my context didn't mean anything other than it was sort of like the equivalent of getting into philosophy a lot, in the sense that it didn't make any difference to friends around me. They didn't have a context to it, but it was just sort of like my thing in my head. I grew up pretty Catholic, but when I was 16, 17, I decided to become a Buddhist. While today I'm not like any one thing, I never stopped being one. It's more like it's just not my primary identity in a sense. And that was very unusual where I grew up. Later I would learn that I'm also autistic and stuff, but at the time I didn't quite know that. So I was always sort of in my own world, I think, at least at that stage of my life. Hence the books and the movies.
What got you into writing or starting to create media? I know you through your work with The Fire These Times, which I've been a big fan of for a while. And you also have done like writings from the kafala system up to a lot of other international perspectives.
So I had this blog when I was 20. I'm now 35, so that's like 15 years ago now. It was at a time when blogging was a thing, like as an end in itself. And I enjoyed very much the process of experimenting with language, different things I would focus on. At the time, it was largely like local. I was still in Lebanon, so it was just local stuff. I would talk about, this case of someone who was discriminated against, or the kafala system, as you said. So it's been a focus of mine for a while, stuff like that. I was always interested in writing, but I don't think I enjoyed it as much as a kid compared to in my later years, like mostly in my 20s. It's where I kind of just, I don't know, something in me got activated. And it's partly to do with the fact that I write in my third language, English, for the most part. I grew up with French and Arabic as my dominant languages. And I think there was something about the fact that it was my third language that was kind of neutral in my head that allowed this sort of freedom, I guess, to explore things that maybe I wouldn't have in another way, I think, in a different context.
Was a lot of the stuff you were reading in English, or do you also read in 3 or more languages?
I have 5 languages. I don't read in all of them, though. It kind of depends on... They're not all in my head at the same time, sort of a complicated thing, but I used to read mostly in French and Arabic growing up. Then I switched to English when I did my university studies, because that was in English. And that kind of became my thinking language. And then at some point, I ended up reading a lot of books in Spanish. And now, because I'm learning Italian, because my partner is Italian, I've been trying to read more books in Italian. But it's still largely English, I would say. That's my dominant language in terms of books. In terms of news and whatnot, it's a bit of a mix. Like in terms of what I get in terms of sources, or depending on the job I'm doing, the work I'm doing.
What kind of led to, from the writing into The Fire These Times and from the periphery as this media ecosystem?
The Fire These Times started... So I mentioned I had that first blog, and I had first done a podcast with that one. It didn't last very long, and I really wanted to do a new thing. And it was at the same time, I was already a lot, like very much into James Baldwin. I had kind of discovered him in 2016, 17. And The Fire Next Time, which was the book that he wrote, is one that has really influenced me. And so that's where the title of the podcast comes from, The Fire These Times. And I found the framework, like you might call it the Baldwinian framework or whatever, pretty useful, even in contexts like the one I grew up in. So I had written an essay, I think it's like 10 years ago now, I don't remember, basically called something along the lines of like a Baldwinian reading of Lebaneseness or something like that, by which I focus a lot on, the othering that Baldwin focused on a lot, like the whole thing of, I am not the N-word, but you created him, so that's like your problem. So you have to figure out why you needed that. In context of Lebanon, I mean, it's not the same thing. Things don't translate in the same way. But for a lot of people, the only definition of Lebaneseness is that they are not Palestinian or they are not Syrians. That's kind of the only definition that they all relate to in a way. I'm simplifying a bit, but that's the gist of it. You mentioned the kafala system with migrant domestic workers in Lebanon being obviously racialized. That's like this additional layer to Lebanese identity that is often underexplored. And Baldwin, for me, has been very, very useful to think through that lens in a way that I wasn't able to think along those lines before discovering Baldwin.
I find that really interesting because, of course, you've been doing your media and journalism work for quite some time, but like, has your relationality to Baldwin's work changed through that time, or your relation to The Fire Next Time changed?
I just keep on discovering him again. It's endless. I just got a book like a few days ago, the new biography that came out, this giant book, and I haven't even started reading it.
I finished that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I haven't done that yet. Whether it's his, whether it's reading stuff like his work or even like biographies of him or whatnot, or like just listening to him talk, there's just something about the way he talks and watching him talk as well, like both at the same time. There's just something that's very, I never have the proper words for this, but it always makes me think in a way that is very serious while also being very emotional. I think I'm describing it badly, but there's like both at the same time. And that's like a very rare combination.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially since he was a preacher and an orator. And there's even like some of his novels that I love listening to the audiobooks or readings more than the experience of reading it, because I feel like how he uses the word, it's like words or like oration is like super interesting. And
it's a continuously evolving thing. And I would go like, I don't know, a few months where I don't engage with his work or whatever because I'm doing something else, and then I do it again, and then there's just something I've missed the first time around.
Could you talk about Lebanon's political order and kind of explain it for folks that are unfamiliar in the audience with some of that like history and how state power and grassroots resistance has kind of shaped things like over the years, or just like some background?
I guess the easiest way to explain Lebanon is that it's a state that formally declared independence in the 40s, but its kind of formation is a bit longer than that, and there was such a thing as Lebanese nationalism before a thing called Lebanon. It was very much historically intertwined with a very specific, I guess you might call it middle to even upper class, like an elite that was during the French Mandate, so that's the period of roughly 20 years between the First and the Second World War, when France was basically given what is now Lebanon and Syria, and the UK, well, the British Empire at the time were given what is today, well, Palestine, obviously, and Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, and other parts of that's when they carved out the region, basically, after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And Lebanon had a very special status in the sense that it's a sectarian system in its origins, which means that there aren't any majorities really in the context of Lebanon in terms of like religious majorities or even ethnic majorities. And the political system is divided on a sort of a sectarian quota. So the president has to be a Maronite Christian, the Speaker of Parliament has to be a Shia Muslim, Prime Minister has to be a Sunni Muslim, and then the various like high-ranking positions are also divided along those lines, like the governor of the bank, or I don't know, head of the army, or what have you. And that has essentially been a way for, well, the past few decades now, for the ruling elites in Lebanon to reproduce themselves by, essentially pitting certain population against one another. They all have like a sort of an origin myth in the sense that like we fought whether the invaders or the foreigners or the whatever it might be. That's sort of like the very broad strokes of it. And in terms of like how the state functions, it's in many ways like elsewhere, in the sense that it's a capitalistic state. They have a monopoly on violence. Well, in the case of Lebanon, it gets complicated because you do have a group like Hezbollah. Now it's a bit unclear, but historically has had more power than the Lebanese army itself. It kind of complicates the picture. But generally speaking, it's like there is a ruling elite. They own most of the land. The religious institutions get mixed in with all of that. So like the Maronite Church, for example, owns a significant percentage of the land and stuff like that. Historically, they've either co-opted, the various sects have either co-opted certain unions or have crushed them or have teamed up together to do that. So when there is class interest, essentially they unite the elites essentially to crush everyone else. In terms of grassroots, it's been a journey, I'd say. Like it has shifted quite a lot in the past. If you think of like the Arab Spring onwards, like 2011 onwards, Lebanon didn't have an Arab Spring in the same way. Our moment, so to speak, came in 2019, so much later. And a lot had to happen for that to be possible in the first place. A lot of failed uprisings, you might say, a lot of like strikes, union mobilizing, that sort of thing, which is rendered just much, much more difficult in Lebanon. I mean, not that there are lots of places where it is more difficult, but in Lebanon, it's difficult in a particular way, in that you're not just organizing across class, but you also have to deal with the sectarian question. A lot of Lebanese, even like anti-sectarian Lebanese, are still nationalistic, even xenophobic. So they would exclude, as I mentioned earlier, like migrant domestic workers, Syrian workers, Palestinian workers, and so on. And that's always been a problem. And it's not a problem that's been resolved. But that's like, to put it mildly, like one of the many, many tensions that continues to exist in Lebanon today.
I love in a lot of your work you talk about memory, and I think one of the things that you write about was called like hauntology. I was wondering if you could break it down, and also kind of how you talk about nostalgia with memory. Curious what that looks like for you now.
So Hauntology, my newsletter is called Hauntologies, and it comes from this concept that was initially coined by Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher. It has had different manifestations since, like Mark Fisher, who wrote Capitalist Realism, also talked about hauntology a lot. In the case of Lebanon, there is an intellectual called Jalal Toufi, who I've used a lot as well in my own work. And it's essentially a way of treating political ghosts very seriously. By which is meant, like, I mean, honestly, if you want to talk about Baldwin, there is an element of that is very hauntological. That, like, that debate he did with Buckley. And at some point he says, like, but towards the end, like his concluding remarks, he says something along the lines of, like, if this isn't dealt with, like if the racial question or whatever isn't dealt with, it will also be dangerous for white people. And that's a hauntological framing, in the sense that the populations that are being erased, the causes that are being destroyed. In the case of Lebanon, the people that were forcibly disappeared, for example, during the war, between 1975 and 1990, there were a series of wars that are usually called the Civil War altogether. And those people were erased. There was an amnesty law in Lebanon that basically forgave these crimes. If you like your son was disappeared by one of the militias, come 1990, there's nothing you can do about it anymore. You cannot sue whoever, there's no court case because the crime doesn't exist anymore. But your son is still disappeared, or your husband, or it tended to be men, because they were, most of those who were like armed fighters. And that's an example of a hauntological understanding that what is post-war Lebanon, so like if you think of it's after 1990 officially, but what is it for someone whose loved one was forcibly disappeared? When did the war end? And of course, the answer is that it never ended. It's still with them. And it's the rest of the country that's pretending otherwise. And it's like the ghosts speak back, in a sense. So it's ghosts in this metaphorical sense, obviously. But I don't know, like we see in the US today, I feel like you could read Baldwin like 50 years ago, and it's as though he was writing about 2026. There's a bit of this almost hauntological, I don't know, instinct almost, or whatever you might call it. Especially someone like him was particularly sensitive to these things. It's helped me personally frame a lot of what's happening, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Israel, Palestine. I'm also part Palestinian. And for example, in the case of Zionism, this endless need almost to erase the Palestinian, to the point where, like, even this is an insight I've gotten from both like Palestinian thinkers, but also like Israeli thinkers who are very critical, have concluded that what is Israeli identity without the Palestinian? If they didn't have this other to constantly fixate on, constantly have a boogeyman, constantly have an enemy from from without that's also within, or what have you. What is the body politic of the Israeli without that other to demonize and to scapegoat? And that's a hauntological framing in that sense. You're looking at the people being erased, or the groups of people being erased, and you're kind of recentering them. And through them, you then understand the dominant culture, or the culture of the oppressors, which is for me very much what Baldwin did. Like he had first this almost double consciousness when he talked about it, of he didn't even know he was black up until like a certain age when he was a kid, because that didn't mean anything as a kid. As a kid, you're just a kid. But then it's society that keeps on telling him that this is who you are, this is what you are, or whatever. And at some point he understood, well, initially he obviously went through a crisis and everything, and he hated who he was, or what have you. And then eventually he realized, well, if they're this obsessed about the N-word in that case, and I am not that, like, what's wrong with you? There's something wrong with you, you know? And again, he put it along this line, like, I'm giving you back the problem. And that's sort of a ontological understanding. Like in Lebanon, if you are a Palestinian or a migrant domestic worker or a Syrian, let's say, migrant domestic workers, a lot of them are the ones that, if you're middle class, for example, I grew up with a migrant domestic worker in my house. She did the cooking, she did the cleaning, she did all of that stuff. And yet when we talk about, my mom's cooking, a lot of people actually mean the migrant domestic workers cooking, but she's not talked about in those terms. She does, it's devalued. And that's, if you then center her experience and try to understand, well, what does therefore Lebanese-ness look like through her lens, or like that experience. It tended to be a woman, so I'm saying her, it's very gendered. It's almost like it crumbles. It's like more fragile now. There's something about it that's inherently just a lie almost, And that's actually one of the to go back to disappeared in the case of Lebanon. There's a woman, it's part of a documentary called Sleepless Nights. Her name is Mayem Saidi. I've talked about her so many times because it's a very moving documentary. But her son was forcibly disappeared. He was 16 in 1982. He was part of one of the communist parties and he was forcibly disappeared by one of the far-right groups. She described all of Lebanon as a lie. That's the term she uses. That there's something fundamentally just wrong and dishonest, just like it doesn't make... it's not coherent in a way. It's just being dishonest about who it is. It's because otherwise, why doesn't she get justice for her son? Or why don't they even tell her where he is? Like, just tell her he's dead. That's what she was saying. Just tell me that he's dead. But even that, So that's where hauntological comes from. And I forgot your other question.
Speaking in relation to nostalgia around Lebanon now, or what you feel like some of the discourses, but also mainly how you're feeling or thinking or moving through that?
Svetlana Boym, I'm mispronouncing her name, coined restorative nostalgia and retributive nostalgia, I think. And now I'm going to butcher them, but people can look those up. And one of those two is, restorative, I believe, is the one where you want to, like, it's kind of like the white supremacy thing. Like you want to go back to some golden age that obviously never existed, but you kind of romanticize that past. And that's the MAGA thing. It's like, past that never really existed. And you're being very dishonest about what actually happened in that past, obviously with oppression and so on. You try to be very innocent about it or whatever, but it's fundamentally toxic or lethal in many ways. There's like one form of nostalgia that's kind of the almost nationalist nostalgia that can be white nationalist, can be like just xenophobic against some foreigner or what have you. We see this a lot in Europe today. You have a lot of political parties in France and Germany and whatnot that are all about things were good up until and whenever the cutoff date is. And then they blame that things getting bad not to neoliberalism or whatever, but to people, just people who look different than them. So there's like the bad kind of nostalgia. There is the good form of nostalgia that's just a recognition that if, for example, a common thing is a lot of people romanticize their childhood. Not everyone, obviously it depends if you had a good childhood. But assuming you did, a lot of people romanticize their childhood. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself. A lot of times it's, well, what are you romanticizing? Maybe you're romanticizing the fact, or like, let's say, what are you remembering fondly? Not to say romanticizing. It could be the fact that you didn't really have to think about capitalism yet. You didn't have to. You were part of a family, assuming everything was like loving or whatever. People were caring for you, and a lot of people who end up being nostalgic for their childhood are often struggling in one way or another, and so this is just a comfortable place to be in one's mind. As I said, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Like it can be a good thing, can be a not so good thing, depending on how one uses it. I know a lot of nostalgia on the left, for example, that can be, again, some of them can be healthy, others can be unhealthy. There's a really good book called Anarchist Modernity by Shoko Nishi. Among other things, he explores mostly Russian and Japanese intellectuals of 100+ years ago, who are anarchists for the most part, and how they communicated with one another and how they tried to think of the world through each other's lens. And like, it's a fascinating read. In terms of transporting myself to that world requires a bit of a romanticization, because of course things were difficult as well and what have you. But I don't need to necessarily, at least in the moment, or maybe in the beginning, as I'm starting this research or this discovery, I don't need to overly think about all of the bad stuff, because I'm gonna get to them anyway. So romanticizing the past can be, or certain aspects of it, depending on when and where. Like, I don't know, if you think of the Maroonings throughout the Americas, or in the South, in the US, or in the Caribbean, or what have you, it wasn't always amazing things. There were problems there, and whatnot, but there was something about it that was extraordinary. There's something there to learn from and whatnot. And it's okay to sort of put aside all of the problems at first, to kind of almost like take in all of the good, and then we can complicate it a bit more and add nuance and what have you. But that's been very useful for me to understand, like, there's a reason why something like that worked for so long, and I want to understand it kind of for its own sake, on its own terms, I guess. So that's where nostalgia for me can be. I can give you a kind of a pop example, like one that I think a lot of people just know. Like, there's a lot of TV shows, usually American TV shows, that are about like nothing really happening. Obviously Seinfeld is kind of the famous one from the early 90s, but more like 20 years ago or so, you have obviously Friends, but you also have like The Office. If you think of The Office, it's like it's about an office. It cannot be more boring than that in terms of the context. But what's kind of nice about The Office, the US version, because the British version is more British, it's more like sarcasm and whatnot, but the American version, what they do doesn't really matter. It's more about them being together there and being kind of stupid and whatnot. And like by the end of it, you kind of really get to know them and they get to know one another. It replicates essentially a version of a community where there is a boss, but no one really takes him seriously, and he doesn't take himself that seriously towards the end or what have you. And it kind of works because no one takes it so seriously, because ultimately it doesn't matter what the job is. What matters is the kind of the relationships with one another. And The Office was massive in the early days of the pandemic. It had this huge success or what have you, or rediscovery, I guess. And it's weird because people for the most part, didn't really miss going to the office. That's not the main thing that they missed. But The Office, as in the TV series, allowed them a bit of a romanticized version of what that could have looked like if that wasn't their direct, experience. And I think that's part of why it ended up being so popular. But yeah, that's among the many ways like nostalgia can be helpful to as an entry point to certain things.
How do you feel like you've seen a relationship to memory, and I guess also still using that memory to like hold yourself and people accountable over different identities, like you were saying with the US and Israel and Palestine and the indigenous cultures here and the Black nation, of how we feel like we're oppressed identities, and how like not every identity or our identity is always in relationship in some way, and kind of in a relationship forced upon us through that like settler colonial identity that you were kind of naming, like makes like there is no whiteness without blackness, there's no Israeli without Palestinian, like.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because there is this term called mnemonic imagination, and I used it a lot when I was doing my PhD. There's a book of that title. The gist of it is memory is acted upon imaginatively. I think that's how they frame it, by which they mean that usually the way we remember things is gonna change with time. So if I remember the same event like that happened yesterday, it's not the same as remembering that event in 10 years. Not because necessarily I forget certain things, I mean that can be part of it, but because I'm a different person in 10 years. I have changed a lot in those 10 years. And certain things maybe then get reframed, what tends to happen is that certain details tend to either be erased, or in some cases we add certain details that weren't there, which isn't to say that we start lying to ourselves. It's more that like the memory is serving a different purpose now than it did at the time. And that's why like memory can be very, it's a massive concept. Obviously it can also be weaponized, and a lot of people in the same way that nostalgia can be weaponized, and those two are interlinked obviously. I've been finding it very, very interesting and helpful as a way of recentering certain things that I had taken for granted. So let's say before discovering Baldwin, I was familiar, like I had the broad strokes of, I never grew up in the US. I never even been there before. Like a few years ago, I have cousins and friends and whatnot. And because it's this hegemon in terms of even media and movies and series, I was very familiar with a lot of things America related. For the most part, it was very white, or whatever it might be, because that was most of the media as well. Baldwin, to go back to him, I was already anti-racist before discovering James Baldwin. And I already knew of sort of like broad strokes of, for example, the civil rights movement in the US. I knew who Martin Luther King was. I knew Malcolm X. And in case of South Africa, I knew like Mandela. I knew Desmond Tutu and whatnot, things that even we learned in school. But it's one of those things where before Baldwin, I still kind of took for granted white America as the default America, because that's the dominant one. That's the one that's everywhere, or what have you. And Baldwin is the one that allowed me to almost like silence that dominant hegemon, at least temporarily, to look at, let's say, what does white America look like from the perspective of Black America, just to simplify it a bit. And then you add and you add and you add, like, what does all of that look like from the perspective of like an indigenous person, and so on and so forth. And there's memory in all of that, because Baldwin had obviously like enslaved people in his immediate family, like in his like recent history. I forgot which clip it was. I think it was one of his clips, not one of the books. I'm sure he wrote about it too. But it's sort of like something clicked in my head when he said it along those lines, because it became just very raw. It's no longer this. I knew that there was something called chattel slavery, and I've heard of the American Civil War and the Reconstruction after, and like it was like, but they were like concepts. They were like, it was very abstracted. He made it just very, very concrete, and then it became easier for me after him and learning and reading other people, Octavia Butler or what have you, to then just take it. I don't know how to say this differently, but just take it very seriously as just a fact of life, in the sense that this was his grandfather or grandparents or great-grandparents, etc., etc., etc. And that's very recent, because I'm seeing him talk like on the screen in front of me. And it's the same thing as if he was literally in front of me in the year 2026. That's how recent it could have been, It's almost like the past that gets flattened. It's no longer just about this thing that happened in the distant past. It's more this thing that could have happened in the recent past. And that's what the book Kindred by Octavia Butler does as well. It's a fictional book, but not for those who don't know it. But essentially, like, she's this Black person and who's dating in the book, who's dating a white person, but something happens. I don't even remember the details. And the Black woman goes back in time. Is transported back in time for different periods of time and so on. But then she gets transported back into the present. And every time this happens, obviously being a Black woman in the 1800s is not the same as being a Black woman in the 1950s or 60s or whenever it was set. And just that, like, kind of like fucked with my brain a bit, It felt like this could be real. Let's assume it could be real. Like, this actually could happen. What would it say about, let's say, America in that case? And then let's look at America, and it's accurate. What the book says, even though it's fictional, is accurate. So it's like not even memory in this case, but if you treat it as though it was, it still helps you understand the broader context,
Yeah, I really like a lot of what you're saying, because a lot of different things come to mind. There's this Kashmiri poet, and one of the lines that I love from one of his poems, I think his name is Aga Shahid Ali, I think is his poem Farewell. And one of my favorite lines is your memory gets in the way of my memory. And that was one of the things that I kept thinking about when I was writing my first book. Like, my family immigrated to the US, and I have this physical attachment to the history here. But the more I started researching my family and understanding loss, or even just doing enough research to give the dead in my family like meaning beyond what I'd assumed my whole life, like that was like a really transgressive process. And I guess it just makes me think about how, I don't know, a function of the state / like revolutionary processes is like when the state murders people for political power or whatever, it's like they're defining those deaths of thousands and thousands of people as basically nothing in the revolutionary process. Like, I think what you're speaking towards with like hauntology is about, like, how do you give the dead meaning? How do you have a relationship with the dead that isn't extractive, which I think like colonization and imperialism so often does. And I hear it so much in like Baldwin's like speeches and writing, especially later, like when people in the civil rights were dying or were killed, and how like it's in the documentary Meeting the Man. He says like, I couldn't write faster because they were killing my friends. And so it makes me think about how it's basically like a continuous process. And I view the state or white supremacy or colonization as like telling you the process ends when we tell you it ends.
Yeah. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, and he was Palestinian, and so he was born in Palestine, in the late 30s, and I had written this essay a few weeks ago. I don't remember the title of the essay, but it dealt with trains, because in the region, like where in Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, and just the Levant, even in Ottoman times and whatnot, you had these railways that connected different major cities, like Haifa in what's now Israel, historically in Palestine, where my grandfather was from, and Beirut, where I went to university, and I grew up not far from Beirut, were connected by a railway. Today, of course, there's the border. There's a very hard border between Israel and Palestine and Lebanon. If you're at the border, like if you're in Lebanon and you go south to the border, you're closer to Haifa than you are to Beirut. Before there was a border, the railway would have been this thing almost that you don't have to think about, because it's just two cities in this area where it was even before the nation state was really formed, where you just took the train from one city to another, in the same way that, I don't know, I live in the UK, and if you take a train from London to Manchester, you don't think about it as like crossing anything really, because there are no hard borders. And so it was like that. And I have this essay where I sort of imagine him taking the train as a kid. I don't know if he ever did. He may have not have. And that train was like ended after the Nakba in 48 and the creation of the State of Israel. And it was kind of fully dismantled in the 50s and 60s onwards. And I just imagine this like boy, like my grandfather, in Haifa, and at some point going elsewhere and whatnot. And then because the Nakba happens, he's not allowed to go back. So it's like it's a one-way train, but he didn't know that it would ever be a one-way train, right? That's a haunting thing to think about, because it's one thing to talk about like the Nakba or Israel or I don't know, Zionism, and the broader it gets, the more abstract it can be as well. But then sort of the question I ask in that essay, and for me it's a very Baldwinian thing to do, is why wasn't he allowed to just go back? Because the little boy is not anti-Zionist or a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or whatever, is just a kid. And that Baldwin has this thing about like, if you don't understand that every kid is your responsibility, there's something you're incapable of morality or something along those lines. And there's something about the fact that these entire superstructures of ideologies, like Zionism, for example, creates this illusion of continuity, as if it was always going to happen the way it did. Whereas what actually happened is that initially you had an initial settler colonial movement, that didn't even want to have, for example, what would later be called Eastern Jews, like Mizrahi Jews from the Arabic-speaking Jews from the former Ottoman empires and so on and so forth, because the initial settler colonists saw themselves as Europeans, and they even adopted a form of white supremacy. And they didn't want to have these kind of darker Jews in the lands with them. And they were very explicit about that. But then they sort of had a population problem. There just weren't enough of them. And there were too many Arabs around them or whatever. And progressively they almost like, it's a bit like how the Irish and Italians became white in America. They accepted we accept more of those folks that we didn't quite like beforehand. Like when they discriminated in the US against Italians and Irish and Jews, obviously Ashkenazi Jews. And it was the same in the case of Israel. But then this entire thing happens, like then more and more groups of people, then they're suddenly okay with Ethiopian Jews becoming Israelis and so on and so forth, while maintaining a very racialized and racial hierarchy within Israeli Jewish society itself. But then within all of this, where is my grandfather? Like, where is he in this entire picture? He's like at the bottom of that hierarchy. And in my head, I just still think of him as a boy, because his only experience of Palestine was as a boy. He wasn't like part of the armed resistance or anything. He was too young for any of that. Why wasn't he allowed to go back? Because like I start thinking almost like logically, like, well, if the Zionist movement was all about creating a state and all of that, well, okay, logically from their perspective, they wouldn't want armed groups or whatnot. Okay, sure. I obviously don't agree with that, but let's say I take their point of view in this. It still wouldn't explain why you're excluding a little child from this entire thing. And to go back to Baldwin, that's in the Raoul Peck documentary, where he talks about I forgot the name of the school in South, where it was forcibly, like, it was integrated, and there were these like one black girl or like few of them that were being escorted by the marshals, whatever it is, to go to school. And you have this entire like group, like masses of white people around them, kids, and because kids would be one thing, but also adults, yelling at her, spitting at her, and she's like 14 or something. There's something about this picture and the contrast of it all. And of course, Baldwin reacts on that a lot. There's clearly nothing wrong with the 13-year-old. She's 13. There's nothing you can really say about her. You can say, oh, it's about this or that, and then you talk about all of the different abstracted notions of white identity or whatever it is. But there's still something wrong in you if you're opposed to this kid going to school. And that's sort of how I see my grandfather in that scenario. Like, ultimately, he would have just been a kid, and it's other people, in this case Zionists, that decided he was a threat, that decided he could never come back home, that decided that our identity, as in us, in this case the Israelis, can only exist if we make sure that people like my grandfather never go back home, right? That for me is very Baldwinian in that way of thinking as well, because you can say whatever you want, and I'm saying that that's what they usually do in terms of like people who are still pro-Zionist or whatever, have these entire like meta narratives about the historical persecution of Jews in Europe, and even persecution of Jews in the Arab world, and things I don't even disagree with whatsoever. But then all of this is mixed in with, therefore, we must have a strong state that is ruthless, that is there's an apartheid system that discriminates against Palestinians, and then all of these things follow through after that. And that's an example of how memory and even nostalgia is weaponized in service of a very violent state, and even a genocidal state in the case of the Israeli one. So yeah, I spoke too much, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. No, thank you. I mean, I love Baldwin, so I love when anytime it's brought into a population. Do you have a favorite Baldwin nonfiction and fiction, or do you feel like you have an affinity towards like his nonfiction kind of naturally? Or
Yeah, I think nonfiction, I just whatever I read, just whatever. I haven't been disappointed. Just whatever I've read of him has been in one way or another very moving. His fiction, I was very, I don't know, I felt very strongly reading Giovanni's Room, very connected to the book. Because, and then there was an interview that he gave, and I think it was the last ever interview that he gave. It was in London. Mavis at 4, I think, was the program in the UK, and he was asked about this novel, and she asks him. It's a very good interview. She asks him something along those lines of like, it's a story about a homosexual man who couldn't find love or something like that. And Baldwin says it's a story about someone who couldn't find love. It doesn't matter if you couldn't find love with a man or a woman or whatever. That is the thing that hurts. Yeah, I just love that book.
yeah, I'll be so curious what you think of the biography, because I don't know, I read it, and I mean, I guess I cry whenever I finish a Baldwin biography in general, but it really made me kind of sad for him in his life, especially in relation to love. And I don't know, there's a lot there.
Yeah. No, I look forward to reading it. I went to that's why I met you at the time in Saint Paul de Vence years ago. That was a good thing. I went to his place, and unfortunately the house is no longer there. but it felt a bit like a haunting to go back to that like space for me, just that it's still very white as a space. And at the time I was living in Switzerland, and he has this, I forgot where he wrote this, but he has this piece where he went to Switzerland a couple of times for like, I think his boyfriend was Swiss or something. He was in this village in the German speaking part of Switzerland where a lot of people had just never seen a black person ever in their entire lives. It was both disorienting to read it, because Switzerland, I mean, it's still very white, but it's not that extreme anymore. It depends where. But it was both disorienting in the sense of like, how could this be? Like, it's so whatever, but also it was very recent. It was just a very recent thing, you know, in the timeline of whatever. It was, I don't know, 60s or 70s or something. And my mom was born in 1960. So in my head, it's already, well, this is just already within her lifetime. And that's, again, it's just one of those experiences where things get flattened in the sense like this could just happen also today. It would be as revelatory as him experiencing it at that time.
I really love that essay, and I feel like when I've traveled to other parts of the world and I have had experiences kind of like that, I always think back to it. Have you seen the TV adaptation of that essay, Stranger in the Village? Like, it's really good, and
No, not yet.
you should check it out. It's very cinematic and artful, and he reads from sections of it, and it's great.
No, definitely check it out. Thanks.
In your work, you've critiqued simplistic leftist campism. So could you kind of talk about how campus thinking limits how folks engage with struggles like what are happening in Lebanon or Iran or other places in the region, and just kind of like, how you've been unpacking it or working through it, especially recently?
It's been a long journey on that as well. It was initially through my exposure to the Syrian revolution. So this was in the immediate aftermath of 2011. I was at university from 2010 to 2013 doing my undergrad at the American University of Beirut. And at the time, it was still pretty common for AUB, the university, to have a lot of folks from the rest of the Arab world. And I got to meet a lot of Syrians who, because Lebanon is tiny, and if you do like Beirut, Damascus is, I don't know, 3-4 hours by car. A lot of them were going back home on the weekend, for example, or what have you. And so they were talking to me about the uprising that ended up becoming a revolution, and many of them ended up like joining, whether it's local councils or local coordination committees that developed pretty very fast for a context like Syria that had very little organized. It's not that it didn't have any organizing history, but most of that was crushed very violently multiple times over. By Hafez al-Assad, the dictator, the father first, and then by Bashar, the son, as of 2000 when he took over. And yet that's something still that they managed. In the absence of the state, they did create like a form of like municipal council-ism, whatever you want to call it, where no one was even, for the most part, were even talking about identifying themselves as anarchists, for example, besides Omar Aziz, who's this Syrian intellectual that wrote about that topic at the time. All of this happened, and then as the revolution became a civil war, and then the civil war became Islamized, and then even that became kind of a regional conflict, and then like foreign powers started meddling and whatnot, it became extremely complicated. It's still, for me, there was still almost this essence that was never entirely lost in a lot of people who experienced those early days, for example. Again, and not also to romanticize them either, there were a lot of problems. But something extraordinary was achieved in the local councils and in the local coordination committees. But if you don't know that, and if the only thing that you know about the Assad regime at the time was that it called itself anti-Zionist, or it called itself anti-whatever, it's very easy to then conclude if like because a lot of people, the way they are introduced to the region, if they're not from the region, is usually through Israel-Palestine. And then it becomes a bit of an easy, almost a simplistic thing to look at, like, who are the states that say that they are pro-Palestine and who are the states that say that they are pro-Israel. And then the details then don't matter. And then states replace people instead of looking at what people are doing and what individual movements are doing. You end up taking this entire structure as like the nation state of Syria as being almost like one person in the case like of Bashar al-Assad, and everything gets simplified through that framework. My experience has been like, no matter how many times I've said or argued that like all of these things, like Bashar al-Assad was actually cooperating with George W. Bush in the CIA during the War on Terror to torture people on behalf of the Americans. Hafiz al-Assad regime was part of their coalition that ended up going against Saddam Hussein. Not that I was at any point sympathetic with Saddam Hussein either. So on the side of the Americans, they, against Syria, invaded Lebanon in the 70s, effectively on behalf of the Americans, or at the very least telling the Americans that we will do so in order to crush the Palestinian resistance. No matter how many things I would throw at people like this is what happened, it still wouldn't matter because it didn't fit within this wider narrative of an axis of resistance that had Iran at its head and these various militias like Hezbollah and the others, and of course the Assad regime versus the American and the Israeli empire and so on. To complicate it, I've found in my experience that a lot of people don't want to complicate it in that sense. Almost as if, and this has also been my experience, complicating it means you end up almost like devaluing how bad a state like Israel is. Like if I tell you that the Assad regime committed a massacre in 1982, and the Hama massacre, there are no figures, but up to like 20 to 30,000 people were massacred in a matter of like a few weeks. And that's more people than the far-right Israeli-backed group in Lebanon, in Beirut, committed in the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And there's a lot of people that I think when they take these two together, it's almost like because we have to think about Israel first, we don't have space to think about what the Assad regime did. I'm sort of like simplifying a bit. And that's a problem if you care about, well, victims of very violent regimes and fascistic regimes, as in the case of the Assad regime and so on. And also you miss the commonality between the Israelis and the Syrian regime at the time. You miss the things that they actually had in common. Both of them, for example, invaded Lebanon. The Israelis did so in the 70s first, but then especially in 82, and the Syrian regime did it in 76. And one thing that happened is that the Syrian regime, as I said, invaded Lebanon in 76, explicitly to crush this big umbrella term called the Lebanese National Movement that was allied with the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, that was by 76, so 1 year after the Civil War started, sort of winning the war. They had like the more people on their side, and they had more of the territory and so on, versus these far-right Christian nationalists that were the ruling elites in Lebanon. It's the Syrian regime that actually intervened on behalf of the Christians in order to, the Christian far-right specifically, in order to crush the Lebanese National Movement and the PLO. 6 years before the Israelis would invade Lebanon to do the exact same thing, to destroy the remainder of the Palestinian resistance, to destroy the communists, the Lebanese communists and so on, to besiege Beirut in 1982 and ultimately to exile the PLO to Tunisia. And the Syrian regime did that very same thing 6 years before the Israelis did. And yet that's not part of the history. Because then the history is not, in my mind, like if this isn't part of the history, then what matters is not something like the Palestinian resistance. What matters are states. So it doesn't matter that Palestinians are being oppressed. What matters is who is oppressing them. And that for me, like it decenters the oppressed. And that's a huge problem for me as someone who's on the left and who's an anarchist and internationalist and whatever. Because that's the same thing in Syria. The Syrian regime has always seen one of its main enemies as like any kind of autonomous Palestinian movement. They were fine with Palestinians calling themselves Palestinians as long as they were submissive, as long as they submitted to the authoritarianism of the Assad dynasty, which lasted 50 plus years in the end. They crushed a lot of Palestinians, as I said. They disappeared a lot of Palestinians. They killed Syrian and Palestinian Syrian communists and so on, and they exiled a bunch of them. But that's not, for the most part, part of almost like it's not part of left-wing history, when a lot of people who are not from the region, and to be clear, a lot of people in the region do the same thing. I'm not saying like everyone in the region has good politics or whatever, but it erases an entire tradition of people who were both anti-Zionist and anti-Assad, who were both like against sectarianism in Lebanon and also wanted democracy in Syria, as if the only way to exist was to choose one or the other, as if you can only be anti-Zionist, but if you're anti-Zionist, you have to accept that Syria can never be a democracy. That's, for me, it's a false binary that has never solved anything. It has certainly not liberated any lands. It has no success rate whatsoever. But that's like a big part of today. And to talk about Iran, I mean, we are in a context where Iran is actually not the aggressor, in the sense that it is the Americans and the Israelis that started this war. If you only know that, you wouldn't understand why there were Iranians on the streets celebrating when Khamenei was killed. because then you would just think, well, these people are brainwashed or they are pro, I don't know, America or whatever. You just ignore their own lived experiences. That it is actually very possible to have a lot of complicated feelings about how Khamenei was killed, because it wasn't us, the Iranians, let's say, who overthrew him, because there's been time and time again multiple uprisings in Iran against the very Ayatollah that ended up being killed. You have a lot of complicated feelings, even maybe being angry about it and whatnot, because ultimately they deprived the Iranian people of holding the guy accountable in any way, shape, or form, while at the same time being relieved that the guy who just a few weeks before this happened had massacred at the very least thousands of Iranians, and maybe you lost someone, maybe there are lots of people who are still forcibly disappeared, there are mass graves and so on, and you're just glad that the guy who did this is gone. And that can be as simple as it is in one's head. It's very complicated, it's messy, it's contradictory even, but it is what it is. A lot of Syrians celebrated when the Israelis killed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. Not because they were pro-Israel, because Israel was also bombing Syria, but because Hezbollah intervened militarily in Syria on behalf of the Ayatollah at the time to prop up the Assad regime, the very regime that was massacring Syrians. So they weren't happy that this is who killed him. They were just happy that he was gone. And if you don't think about these complexities or what have you, which I don't even think are that complex in and of itself, you're not thinking about people in those regions as people, as individuals with complex feelings and contradictory things, and some of them may not even have good politics, but it doesn't mean that they deserve to be oppressed, or it's not something that I think a lot of people have. I mean, to be fair, a lot more people I think these days are engaging in this kind of more nuanced way. But as someone who's been thinking about tankies for quite some time now, it felt very lonely for quite some time before I think now it's gotten a bit better, although there's still that problem that's still with us. So yeah, campism for me kind of just reproduces the logic of the oppressor. I can give you another example quickly. Historically, Pan-Arabism, well, it was a number of things. I'm simplifying a bit here. But sort of the version of it that dominated was in the figure of Nasser, of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the head of Egypt at the time. Nasser is still very romanticized today. Even though he was nowhere near a friend of the left, he wasn't a fan of unions. He nationalized the Suez, but on behalf of the state, not on behalf of a kind of a democratic control of the people of Egypt or what have you. I still prefer that he nationalized it rather than it being an Anglo-American whatever. That's still better than what it was. But I'm not happy that this was its final form in a sense. But one of the many things that Pan-Arabism did wrong is that it almost accepted the binary that Zionism had when it came to Jews and Arabs. Zionism was basically you can either be a Jew or you can be an Arab. A lot of people were just both, because obviously Jewish is also a religion. So a lot of people were ethnically Arabs, but also Jewish, had Arabic as their first language, but also practiced Judaism instead of Islam, Christianity, etc., etc. Israel, one of its kind of foundational tenets, if you want, is that actually you can only be one or the other. And unfortunately, a lot of pan-Arab authoritarian states accepted that and then turned to their own Jews, in a sense, like Syrian Jews, Iraqi Jews, Egyptian Jews, and told them, you can either be Egyptian or Jewish. You can either be Syrian or Jewish. That has done nothing for the quote-unquote Arab cause. If anything, it just strengthened Zionism and strengthened Israel, because Israel or Zionism's entire thing has been there's nowhere in the world is safe for Jews except here. And you have the pan-Arabists, the states in that case, saying, well, actually, they're right, you're not safe here, go over there. And that didn't do anything to strengthen the Arab cause. It just strengthened the Zionist one in that sense. And that's another example how campus thinking, in that sense, or very binary type thinking, ends up just strengthening the hands of the ones that you were supposedly opposed in the first place.
I don't call a lot of things statist, but it's stuff like that where I'm that's statist thinking. That's pure, harden the border, have to find where do I create my monopoly on power, let alone violence. I'm curious how you navigate conversations, or not even navigate conversations, but think about the framing, because it's also pretty statist to think of the whole axis of resistance framing and what that looks like. Because I feel I've really appreciated all of your writing on Hezbollah and about Iran and about Lebanon and the history there, giving context to where and why something or armed groups exist, and always relating it back to What do people think? What has been like levels of accountability through time?
Well, Hezbollah for me is the perfect case study because in the context, it didn't exist before the 80s. There's only one reason why it came into existence in the first place, which is that the Israelis militarily invaded southern Lebanon and the siege of Beirut, as I said, and so on. And all of the massacres that came after that, I mean. There wouldn't be a need for al-Muqawamah. Al-Muqawamah just means resistance in Arabic, which now is associated with Hezbollah as a party. And Hezbollah just means party of God. Hezb just means party, and Allah is God, obviously. There wouldn't be a need for a resistance against anything were it not for the fact that there was a foreign occupier in the first place. So if you don't start with that, you won't understand why a lot of people who even have like complicated feelings about Hezbollah today still stick with them because they don't see any alternatives. No one else has a history of resisting Israel in a successful way. Now, that's a problem for a lot of Westerners who don't want to look at how Lebanon experiences, how the Lebanese have experienced things, of how Palestinians have experienced things, and who end up also adopting the status framing where like anything that goes beyond, I don't know, an Israel-centric worldview doesn't make sense or what have you. And that's a huge problem, obviously. Unfortunately, kind of like, it's not quite the flip. I don't want to make equivalencies necessarily because the people who are, for example, tankies are not the ones dropping the bombs. They don't have that kind of power. But it's my problem with that sort of framing, and I'm going to explain what I mean in a sec, is that it ends up reinforcing again the narrative of the main discourse of the oppressor. Hezbollah did indeed grow in the context of the civil war in Lebanon and the invasion of southern Lebanon. But as I said, it also came a few years after the Assad regime had initially invaded Lebanon as well. And by then, you had a resistance against the Israelis who were already attacking Lebanon. There was already invasion even before 82 and so on. But it wasn't like an Islamist-only group that was fighting them. It was this broad coalition that included some Islamists, some communists, some nationalists, some what have you, that had a broadly progressive agenda, but ultimately their only goal was defeating the Israeli occupation of the South and just resisting against Israel and pushing them back and so on and so forth. And they were all anti-Zionist ideologically. As I said, they were initially crushed by the Syrians, and then they were crushed against by the Israelis. But then when Hezbollah came into the scene in the 1980s, they followed what you can call the Iranian playbook, by which I mean that it was, of course, after the Islamic Revolution in 79, the one that brought the Ayatollah and defeated the Shah. And at the beginning, the people that would end up becoming kind of the Ayatollah's men were fine with, for example, Iranian communists around, because the Iranian communists were also against the Shah. But what ended up happening is that after the Shah was defeated, the Ayatollah took power and started crushing the communists because they were the inconvenient other. It's one thing to like say you are against the Shah as the Ayatollah. That's an easy story. It's one thing to say that you are against, I don't know, Zionism and whatnot, or America, imperialism and so on. That's an easy story for Iranians in the sense that, you know, the Americans had done a coup d'etat in the 50s. And it's an easy bad guy in that sense to sell to the people because they did in fact do these evil things. But then the communists were a problem because they were locals. They were Iranians. They also wanted the foreign invaders gone, but they did not want a supreme leader. And this patriarchal, clerical, fascistic thing that ended up happening, like taking over Iran, they didn't want that either. And I'm not just talking about communists, there were socialists, there were like liberals even who also were not happy with the Ayatollah and so on and so forth. And those people were crushed. And that's the Iranian playbook. Hezbollah did a kind of the same thing. By the time they came on the scene in Lebanon, there weren't that many remnants of that initial resistance left, but there were some. And Hezbollah actually took part in killing some of the intellectuals of that movement. People like Mehdi Amil and Hassan Roué, who were both like Shia Marxist intellectuals from southern Lebanon, the same southern Lebanon that Hezbollah was vying for power. And if you don't know that, then it's easier to see them as a party that only did good things by resisting Israel. And I'm not saying that wasn't a good thing. I'm saying that if you only know that, you're erasing everyone else who also tried to resist Israel. And many of them did actually pay the ultimate price. In the sense they were killed by the Israelis. A lot of people who don't know that end up saying things like, you cannot talk about this now because the Israelis are bombing and the Israelis are the one committing all of these crimes. I don't disagree that there's a timing for these kinds of conversations. The problem is that these types of conversations end up never happening in the first place because there ultimately is never a really good time to have them. And that's sort of where my motivation is, to talk about these complexities. And it doesn't stop me, for example, from saying, well, if the Israelis are bombing Lebanon and there is no one other than Hezbollah in Lebanon that can retaliate, that's not something I'm necessarily opposed to. What I am opposed to is Hezbollah repressing Lebanese people. What I'm opposed to is Hezbollah intervening militarily in Syria to crush the uprising there. Those are the things I'm opposed to. And I'm ultimately fundamentally opposed with the form of like conservative Islamism that they profess, because I don't agree with it whatsoever. And I think it's very authoritarian.
As around resistance and grassroots resistance evolved, and breaking that around the resistance part of conversation?
I think not yet, because it's a difficult conversation to have in and of itself. It's very trauma induced. It's very like a lot of people are still suffering from the Israelis today. And so it's not just one of those things where they can just, for the most part, like disconnect and have these rather abstract conversations. And that's why like I don't talk about these things in the context of like a I don't know, social media post or like a take on Instagram or whatever. It's more that I talk about this where I can, like in the context of a podcast or an essay, what I take my time with this and so on, to be more nuanced. I think there's at least some kind of understanding that it is possible to be against Zionism and against settler colonialism and against the Israeli state without also like downplaying what's wrong with Hezbollah. There are lots of people who agree with this, but end up being a bit pragmatic in the sense that they say, we agree that Hezbollah is, to put it mildly, not ideal, but there's just no one else right now in Lebanon that has this sort of capacity. And it is true, as I said earlier, that part of the reason why they ended up becoming kind of this hegemon is because they also took part in suppressing and repressing other people. It's just also a fact that right now there's no one else. And if you're from southern Lebanon, it's very valid for you to believe, and which is true, that the Lebanese state, for example, has effectively abandoned you. And while, maybe you're not Hezbollah's biggest fan, you also don't really have much of a luxury to decide who gets to retaliate against the people that just bombed your neighbors or what have you. It very much depends. These kinds of conversations that I would have very much depend on who I'm talking to, in which context, even in which language. Is it face-to-face? Is it on Instagram? Because those are entirely different audiences, and certain things I would like maybe focus on here instead of there. In order not to, I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't want people to say that because I think Hezbollah has fucked up a number of times and because I think they're fundamentally like a regressive and ultra-conservative group that has blood on its hands, therefore I'm okay with the Israelis bombing my country, because obviously I'm not. It's just one of those things I have to be very careful talking about these things, because especially if people who are going through something traumatic today, if they don't know who I am or they don't know what my background is or whatnot, it can easily seem like I'm dismissing all of that just because I have a beef with Hezbollah, and that's not my motivation.
What do you feel like the relationship between and having a critique of armed actors and autonomous civilian movements, and how people can interpret these differences, especially from context? Like in America, we're very armed, but we don't have a lot of armed actors when it comes to that, especially not Black Panthers, the VLA, the SLA. On the West Coast, it depends on what part of the states you're on.
So in the context of Lebanon, or maybe the Middle East broadly, but if you think of Lebanon and Palestine, Syria and Jordan to some extent, there's always been a distinction between how a lot of Palestinian actions were armed. And even then there's like a caveat in the sense that some of them were backed by states and others weren't. And some of them were fighting one another as well. So there's also that problem. Like it's not perfect by any degree. It is a very messy situation. In the context of Lebanon, the LNM, for example, the Lebanese National Movement I initially mentioned, the broad umbrella thing, did have some external support, but for the most part was like locally organized by like Lebanese and Palestinians who were just seeing this a foreign invader and they wanted to resist it. It almost like was organic in a sense. But even before like the Israeli invasion of 82, as I said, they were fighting against a common enemy. They had a lot of things that differentiated them, like as I said, communists and Nasserites and pan-Arabists and Islamists and whatnot. But the thing that they were opposing is this like far-right Christian supremacist, ultra-sectarian elites, essentially, that wanted to keep the status quo, the pre-Civil War status quo as it was. And a lot of people in Lebanon and many Palestinians as well did not want that. And so that's what brought them together. We don't know, for example, whether if they had succeeded and the Civil War ended in 676 instead of, going on until 1990 as it ended up doing, whether, I don't know, the LNM goes to power, crushes the far right, and then becomes the state. I'm not claiming, for example, that things would necessarily have been perfect after that. There may have been lots of problems, or maybe authoritarianism. I don't know. It never happened, is the point. But that was an example of like an armed movement that did have a vision, but its vision for the most part was a statist one, in the sense that they wanted to replace the existing state. And although I would argue that their vision was a better model for the state than what came before them, because it was very much, as I said, like a far-right, exclusivist Christian sectarian movement and elite and so on, I don't think they were beyond reproach in terms of what would they have done had they defeated that enemy. We don't know because it never happened.
Yeah, I feel like one thing I've been coming into question with, especially over the past couple months, a lot of folks that only remind me, like the people I see online that are like the anti-imperialist campus reminds me of like the worst people I know in real life, which is why I don't talk to them. What is like a route to you for anti-imperialism? Because one thing that I feel like was levied at a lot of our recent posts or people in conversations is like a lack of materiality and more of an emphasis on morality, which I think is a crazy binary to have if you're going to be a material person. I feel like we both come from those contexts of ideology that's in attempt to be non-dogmatic. So I'm curious what anti-imperialism or that framework allows for you, or if you've seen adding different ways to move through the world beyond just a purely anti-imperialist framework because of the audience.
When you were kind of talking through a lot of your perspectives on campism, like I've been trying to think of the functions of it in terms of like the losers I see online or whatever, because I'm like, I'm not having these conversations in my real life. So what is this? But I think one of the things I said is like it's almost like a reaction to Western guilt, or like how like sometimes like white people like overcompensate trying to be an ally, and how there's something about that guilt aspect that it's like, of course I've been born into this project and I received so many privileges and like ravages, but it's like that Western guilt in relation to imperialism. It's like I don't feel as much of an attachment to it as I see like campus kind of like doing in certain spaces. So I feel like that's one way I kind of think about it.
Yeah, that's a big part of like why at least a lot of people end up concluding these things. And it's the same thing, like, they know, for example, if they think of Iran, in my experience, what the thought process is basically, well, Iran had a progressive state up until the CIA did the coup d'etat in the 53, I believe, in the 50s against Mossadegh, and reinstated the Shah. And the Shah ended up becoming like a big ally of Israel and so on, up until the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which brought, of course, the Ayatollah. Now, if you start from the 50s and you look at like what the CIA did, and obviously, a leftist person would be against that and anti that and so on, and you then see that like, well, they brought in this bad guy, the Shah, after that, it's sort of almost logical to some extent to conclude that what came after the Shah, that overthrew the Shah, would be the good guys, because they just overthrew the bad guys, to kind of simplify it a bit. But then, if you are someone who is on the left, supposedly you're pro-unions, supposedly you're pro-organizing, supposedly, you're pro-LGBTQ rights and pro-women's rights, and so on and so forth. And then if you map that out, you take that and you compare it to what has the Iranian state done in the past, since 79, really. The execution of gay people, the crushing of the environmental movement time and time again, even as Tehran, like long before the current war, was experiencing water shortages and may actually be unlivable in the short-term future. Obviously, the crushing of women because they don't want to wear the veil, and the crushing of ethnic minorities like Kurds and Arabs, and and so on and so forth. Even if you're someone who like the binary, which obviously I reject as well, but even if the whole thing, like, you have morality on one side, you have materialism on the other, what has been the material benefit of an Iranian state that is anti-Israel? Sure, but what has been that material benefit to Iranians? A lot of people who are still of that persuasion, like let's say campus and whatnot, would then only blame like Western sanctions for the woes of Iranians in Iran. Western sanctions are a big part of it, absolutely. But Western sanctions did not stop the Iranian state from sending billions of dollars to Hezbollah. It did not stop the Iranian state from intervening in Syria on behalf of Bashar al-Assad. That also cost a lot of money. It was also a decision by a ruling elite of ultra-conservative, ultra-clerical, entirely men, male, this ruling class essentially in Iran, to decide that the Kurdish movement had to be crushed, to decide that the environmental movement, was an existential crisis, to decide that, I think it was last year in 2025, they had one of their largest waves of executions of prisoners in Iranian prisons. Those are like the Israelis did not tell the Ayatollah to execute those prisoners. And the Americans did not tell the Ayatollah kill those environmentalists. That was a decision of the Iranian elites. And even again, if you put aside the morality of it all, killing those feminists and environmentalists and random gay people and whatnot, did that make Iran a more effective opponent of Zionism? How? What is the argument there exactly? One of the fundamental problems with a lot of like resistance movements, for example, in Lebanon, was how male-dominated they were. The IDF have a lot of women. It's one thing we see how they use that even to their own advantage. Look, we are the gender inclusive ones, and all of that stuff. Obviously, in a very hypocritical way, in which they also use that to kill people. But then the other side doesn't have that many women. In the case of Lebanon, for example, did that make the resistance groups in Lebanon more effective against Zionism? What's the evidence for that? It can only be like a patriarchal logic if we say that excluding women from our resistance movement made our resistance movement more effective. Of course, they don't say it that way because they don't engage with this question in that deeply, because ultimately that's a very conservative argument. That's what Pete Hegseth wants to do, for example, with the army in America and whatever it is. That's where this comes from. But that's the same impulse of a group like Hezbollah, and that's the same impulse of the Ayatollah. Just because they are also ideologically opposed to Israel and America, which I also am, doesn't mean that their motives are all good. And that also doesn't mean that they are beyond criticism, beyond critiques, and that shouldn't be opposed, and that we shouldn't support people on the ground, like Iranians on the ground, who many of them paid the ultimate price to oppose the Ayatollah. Those two can be true at the same time. The Ayatollah, as I said initially, the way he was killed by the Israelis, that is, to put it mildly, very problematic. But doesn't mean you have to romanticize the guy. It doesn't mean you have to downplay what he was and what he's done, especially given so many people, including many Iranian leftists, have paid the ultimate price in trying to get rid of that same regime.
How do you move through like the role of the diaspora in working towards like mutual liberation? And one thing I love about the podcast is how you talk about how struggles don't change just because you're a migrant. What that means, like they don't disappear. Like it's respecting that political memory, but also still living through that and carrying that with you. But how have you seen that, or what do you think is the importance? Before I get to how I think you've seen it,
a lot of historical movements were either started or definitely, encouraged, developed by respective diasporas. Benedict Anderson, who wrote Imagined Community, has a lot on this. I don't know, the Filipino diaspora and developing Filipino nationalism, the Lebanese diaspora, for that matter, and developing a Lebanese identity. There's a lot of the diaspora has always had this role. Obviously, it's going to be very different depending on which diaspora and where and when. Because, I don't know, a Lebanese diaspora in the 80s in West Africa is not the same as a Lebanese diaspora in Brazil in the late 1800s. In West Africa, they're most likely to be part of the ruling white elites, for example, like in Sierra Leone, or in Gabon rather, or both actually, if I'm not mistaken. There's a good book called Interlopers of Empire that explores that, for example, how like a lot of Lebanese who moved to West Africa did that almost like on behalf of imperialism in one way or another, where they were like the interlopers of imperialism. But it's not the same as a working class Lebanese that moved to Brazil in the late 1800s because Brazil had an open border policy at the time. Those are like Lebanese as well, both of them, but like very different contexts, very different things, and the potential for liberation is not the same, depending on. What I found very like interesting for me is that there's like two things at the same time. One, I'm part of the Lebanese diaspora. I'm also part of the Palestinian diaspora because I'm both. I'm also part of diaspora in general, and that opens up a lot of very interesting possibilities. When I met Syrians in London like 10 years ago, many of them like first generation, like had, I don't know, went to exile or their parents did or what have you. Me being Lebanese meant even before moving to London, that was in 2015 at the time, that I had like plenty of opportunity to talk to Syrians in Lebanon. But a Syrian in Lebanon is politicized in a very specific way. There is sectarianism, as I mentioned. Most Syrians are Sunni, so if you're someone who's not Sunni, you're Lebanese Christian, for example, you may view them as like the Sunni other. I'm simplifying a bit. There's, of course, the class dynamic. Like a lot of Syrians who go to Lebanon are migrant workers, so they would be working class. So there's like, if you're middle class, there's this class dynamic, etc., etc. But when I moved to London, I was just a migrant, and that other Syrian was just a migrant. And we were both, as far as the state is concerned, for example, they don't give a shit. The British state doesn't care about whether you're Lebanese or Syrian. You're just from over there. And you're a racialized Arab migrant from over there. And that actually allowed us to see each other as like having these things in common. Because we had this experience in common. So even when the experience is not yours to choose, for example, there are still certain things that, one can do, let's say. And that's how like even my relationship with Syria changed after 2015. Even though, as I said, I knew Syrians in Lebanon and I was already anti-Assad and whatnot, but it was like the situation forced me and Syrians and Palestinians and other members of the Arab diasporas, for example, in a certain context where we had so much more in common than we had that differentiated us. And in fact, the things that differentiated us ended up becoming a bit funny and light. And like certain quirky things, like the way we speak Arabic is different, and maybe our cuisines are slightly different and whatnot. But it was no longer almost like this fundamentally, almost existential thing. Like, if Syrians in Lebanon, or if there's a lot of Syrians in Lebanon, maybe your Lebanese identity starts being diluted. Because as I said, there's a lot of that going on in terms of what is even a Lebanese, and so on and so forth. Whereas like being in London together in that context, it's like we were cheating almost. Like we skipped all of that. We didn't have to think about any of that in those same ways, because we were both students in that same university and we had one thing in common, which is in our language, our cultures, or whatever it might be. That allowed me to connect with Syria, with Syrian history, with the Syrian revolution, Syrian culture, in a way that I never did while I was in Lebanon, even though Lebanon's neighbor is Syria. But the context changed because both of us were then displaced. Me and those Syrians and other friends that I met after that. Or, if you think of the Black Atlantic, or you think of like so many other of contexts where a lot of it is essentially people that were displaced, often against their will, whether obviously because of chattel slavery, or in the case of like my grandparents because of like economic pressures or repression, or both, or what have you. I'm the fourth in a line of fourth generation of people who have moved. Like my parents have migrated, my grandparents have migrated, my great-grandparents have migrated in one way or another to different parts of the world. That's why I have the Argentinian citizenship. I have cousins in Brazil. I have cousins in Iraq. I have cousins in Paris and cousins in America and whatnot, because the Lebanese diaspora is pretty big. And that can, if you want to, like if you want to adopt that lens of like, for example, in non-statist perspective, I start looking at like those other Lebanese in America as having things in common with me, regardless of the fact that they have a different passport. And then it's almost like I end up, again, it's almost cheating, or it's a hack or whatnot. Again, it doesn't always work. It doesn't mean like anyone who's Lebanese I would necessarily have everything in common with or whatnot. It allows for that like potentiality that can then be explored. And diaspora has that potentiality. Diaspora is like the default human experience in a sense. It's actually unusual not to be part of some kind of diaspora, historically speaking. to have been like in the same place forever. With the exception, of course, of like indigenous populations. Of course, there's like a different history there. But even there's movement. There are people who were in like, I don't know, south of what's currently the US, but end up becoming, north of what's currently Canada or what have you. There's been movement there as well, and you can apply some of that lens to their context as well. But yeah, that's the potential of diaspora, is that it can be absolutely a very powerful way of challenging authoritarian government back home, so to speak. It can also be used in a toxic way. In the same way that you would have like part of the Iranian diaspora that want to reinstall the Shah. Lebanese diaspora in America, for example, many of them are pro-Trump because they want to reinstall some kind of Christian supremacist state in Lebanon, the thing that led to the Civil War in the first place. So diaspora doesn't have to be good. Or I mean, in the UK and in the US, like the Hindutva diaspora, like the Indian Hindu extremist diasporas that are extremely like Islamophobic and homophobic and all of that stuff, while being also British and also American. So diasporas don't have to be. It's not like an inherently good thing. It's just that it has that potential within and that can be explored.
Something we're all facing is some sort of environmental collapse, but I think Lebanon specifically it feels with this war with like specific ecocide. If you could talk or explain some of that to our audience.
Yeah, the Israelis have been committing ecocide essentially for the past 2 years. Just a few weeks ago, actually, they sprayed a herbicide throughout parts of southern Lebanon above crops and essentially killing them and rendering the land unusable. It's not a new thing, but the Israelis have done this before. And of course, they do this in Palestine all the time. They destroy olive trees all the time. I think I saw one statistic like in the time span of, I think, between 2021 and 2024 or something like that, some 3 million olive trees were destroyed by Israelis in the West Bank and Gaza. I think actually only in the West Bank, and like Gaza is an entirely different thing. It's a ridiculously high number. And so that's something that's kind of been part, and it is part of settler colonialism, because a fundamental tenet of settler colonialism is not just that you want the land and you want to take the land, is that the land is wrong. There's something wrong with the land that you want to shape according to wherever you're from or however you see it. In the case of the Israelis, it's not that they don't want olive trees, but they just don't want Palestinian olive trees. Like even olive trees have been filtered through this lens. I mentioned this in that same essay about the trains. Like, what did the olive tree do? The olive tree is not anti-Zionist or Islamist or Christian or Muslim or communist or whatever. It's just an olive tree. It's the Zionists in that case that decided that this olive tree is a threat, because this olive tree to them represents livelihood for Palestinians. And as we said a few times, fundamentally they cannot accept the Palestinian as just another part of the land. The Palestinian has to be this eternal other. And if the Palestinian has to be this eternal other, well, the olive tree also has to be this eternal other, unless it can be like Hebrewised or like Israelized or whatever in one way or another. And in Lebanon is very much the same thing in a sense. It's not settler colonialism, at least not yet. We don't know whether this is part of the plans, because of course they won't tell us. But it is part of the like almost like a wastification, I guess, rendering everything unlivable and creating what the Israelis themselves call a buffer zone. A buffer zone means effectively like a good chunk of southern Lebanon between what is the border, the Israeli border, up until whatever border the Israelis decide, whatever line they decide, will be unlivable, will be defanged as they see it. Obviously meaning no Hezbollah, but also nothing that could lead to anything resembling a Hezbollah. So it's not just about defeating the party like Hezbollah, because they may have already done so by now. Like Hezbollah is much weaker than it's ever been, really. And it's very unpopular in Lebanon for various reasons. It may well be that like Hezbollah is actually being defeated in that sense. That's not the end of the story for the Israelis. There was not a Hezbollah before the 80s anyway, but the Israelis were doing what they were doing even before that. Hezbollah would, in this specific case, I mean, even if they're gone, it's almost like the ghosts of any kind of resistance or any kind of militia movement or any kind of whatever will continue to haunt them in that way, which is why they want to further the destruction and have a buffer zone, and they hope that by doing so, they're like pushing the problem further and further, to the north of them or whatever. That's kind of how they do things. They did the same in Gaza. That's why they've ethnically cleansed everyone that they haven't killed and forced them all into these effectively concentration camps in southern Gaza, so that they can have more space, because that's how they think of things. They don't think of the land as already there and inherently valuable for what it is. they see it as something to exploit in one way or another, because fundamentally this remains a settler colonial movement. And whether they do the settler colonial bit in Lebanon itself, we don't know, like they have done in Palestine, obviously. But at the very least, what they are doing and what they probably continue to do is just making sure that at the very least a percentage of the of southern Lebanon is effectively rendered unlivable, and so that people cannot even be there in the first place, let alone decide to resist this foreign oppressor.
Could you give a bit more context to southern Lebanon and kind of the experience of southern Lebanese over the past 20, 30 years or beforehand?
Yeah, southern Lebanon was historically part of Lebanon, like the other regions of Lebanon. What differentiated it was, in many ways, were two things. One, it has been majority Shia, which means that instead of, for example, like Christians of Lebanon, I don't know, if you're Catholic, like I'm simplifying a bit, but let's say your spiritual head, let's say, is in the Vatican. Obviously, if you're Catholic. And for Sunnis, it would be, of course, like Mecca or Saudi Arabia in some cases, not all. For Shias, it's a bit different. Of course, there is Mecca anyway, as it is for any Muslim. But there are also like holy sites in Iraq and in Iran and also in Syria and elsewhere, but especially in Iraq and especially in Iran. And so even historically, long before what we now call the Iranian state, like the Ayatollahs, long before Hezbollah, there was also like a cultural connection there. It's not like it wasn't invented by the Ayatollahs or whatever. It was there. In fact, the Ayatollahs like used that, like weaponized it rather than the other way around. It's a big part of the country. Southern Lebanon is relatively big. I mean, Lebanon, all of it is small, but percentage-wise is relatively big. It is also diverse. You have Christians in Southern Lebanon and Sunnis and Druze and so on in Southern Lebanon, including Palestinians, of course, who are refugees from what is now Israel. It has been historically a bit of a diverse space in terms of even competing ideological movements. So I mentioned like you had these Marxist intellectuals and these communist movements in southern Lebanon, had a lot of union activity and whatnot. And then as of especially the 70s onwards, you started having more of like an Islamist turn to certain things. In some cases, you had a bit of a mix, like kind of Islamist, kind of Marxist, and like, or maybe like a religious kind of Marxism. And in other cases, not, like one or the other. As of 82, there were already like Israeli attacks before that and even like limited invasions. But the big one was 1982. In 1982, the Israelis invaded all of Lebanon, actually, and they stopped at Beirut temporarily. They besieged Beirut for a number of weeks, killed people like it was in the tens of thousands, and that's when the Sabra and Shatila massacre happened as well. The end of that story was the exile of the PLO to Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, and Israel withdrawing itself to what is southern Lebanon. And they stayed in southern Lebanon until the year 2000. And that's why Hezbollah had this popularity, and what many people still does, because they were the most effective fighters against the Israeli occupation as of the 80s. As I said, my problem is that a lot of people don't want to think about the 70s, and that's a big part of the story. But it is true, of course, that by the 80s and especially by the 90s, they were essentially the only, or let's say the strongest party. I'm not saying the only game in town, but they're definitely the strongest one. And southern Lebanon has always had this sense. The north has also a different story, but southern Lebanon, because of Israel, is what I'll focus on here. That is like they are abandoned by the rest of Lebanon. That the Lebanese state doesn't care for them. They don't see them as Lebanese. There was a man yesterday who was interviewed in one of the local outlets. Megaphone News was this like left-wing independent outlet, and he's in the south. Or I think they interviewed him in Beirut. He's one of those who were displaced from southern Lebanon by the Israelis. And he said, like, I don't even know if I should say, like, I don't know what the translation of this is, but like Fida, so like glory to Lebanon, or something, it's probably wrong, but something along those lines. Instead of, I should say like glory to the South, because I don't know if I'm Lebanese or not. And he said this because like the Lebanese state is not defending them, is not, intervening on their behalf. And that's not new. That's an old thing, or it's an old problem. And it's part of this oppression and even resentment that created a party like Hezbollah in the first place. A lot of things happen after that, but that's sort of like the origin story in a sense. But even since then, even like separately from Hezbollah or whatever, the South has always been treated by the Lebanese state as being like its own thing, like it's separate. It's almost like it's not its concern. And when Hezbollah became the dominant power, the Lebanese state with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah then became part of the Lebanese state, de facto acted as though all of southern Lebanon is just their fiefdom. Like, it's just theirs. They figure it out. Them and their other ally, Amal, who's also a Shia majority party. They're over there. You deal with them. Then you deal with us as a state or whatnot. But like, the South is not like our concern in that say. It's not explicitly said in those terms, but it's basically how the South has been treated by the Lebanese state, as like this other inconvenient other or whatever it might be. And that has contributed to a very strong Jnubi, like a southern identity in Lebanon that is obviously Lebanese, but also separate from, let's say, a Beiruti identity. Like, if you're from Beirut, it's its own thing. That's very strong, and it's not a Shia thing. There are many like Christians who are from the South, and even Sunnis who are from the South, who identify very strongly as primarily being from the South, even before being Christians or Sunnis or Shias or what have you. And it's also one of the agricultural hubs of Lebanon. Lebanon is very import dependent. It imports a lot of things. Of the few things that they do produce is used in the south, in the Bekaa Valley, which is also Shia majority and is also being bombarded by the Israelis, and to some extent in the north as well. So what Israel is doing, for example, now is that it's not just killing people and everything, it's also rendering large parts of southern Lebanon and eastern Lebanon unlivable. And those are the parts where people can actually grow things, at least to like like bigger quantities than they could elsewhere. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell, in a sense.
What impact has this latest iteration of aggression had on migrant work in Lebanon?
It's a bit like when the COVID pandemic started, the migrant domestic workers were like doubly impacted. They were impacted like anyone who is human and has to deal with COVID, but they also have to deal with class and racism and all of that stuff. The kafala system in Lebanon is extremely, one of the worst systems out there that I can think of. Effectively, kafala just means sponsor in Arabic, or sponsorship. So a kafil, i.e. your sponsor, would be a Lebanese person. It's not like it doesn't always happen, but what often happens is that, for example, your passport is the de facto property of the Lebanese person. And so if you don't like your working conditions or they're abusing you or whatever, and as I said, it's very gendered. Most of migrant domestic workers are women from primarily 3 countries like Ethiopia, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka, but also from elsewhere, but especially those 3. You want to flee the house or the household or whatnot, they can keep your passport, they can keep it, whatever, and suddenly you are an illegal person living in Lebanon. And obviously that makes you extremely vulnerable. The crisis has worsened, not even this one only, but even before then. Whatever crisis happens, they're like doubly impacted because of all of that. There are people, for example, in the early days of the economic crisis, like Lebanese people, who decided to leave, and they didn't bother to first organize the papers of, let's say, the Ethiopian woman who lived with them so that she can go back to Ethiopia. They just left, or they abandoned her, in some cases in the house, or they just left in the streets. And this happened a lot, like whether it's the COVID pandemic, whether it's the first iteration of the Israeli bombings in 2024, and now we're seeing a version of that as well. So if the main silver lining in all of this, or kind of the good news, is that a lot more migrant domestic workers are organized compared to before. And you have many, many more organizations. Well, the anti-racism movement is mostly Lebanese and migrant domestic workers, but that's one of them. That they run the migrant cultural centers in throughout Lebanon. But you also have Elia, for example, which is an Ethiopian women-run mutual aid group, effectively in Lebanon, that helps other Ethiopian women and also other migrant domestic workers. And in some cases, even just like poor Lebanese, they do what they do. They just distribute, it's like soup kitchens, and they distribute food and clothes and all that sort of thing. So there's much more organizational power among migrant domestic workers than there were, for example, when I started writing about them in 2010. A lot has changed since, for the better.
From what I remember, there's not like a right to organize like official worker or protections or worker for folks who are impacted or sponsored.
Yeah, exactly. They are excluded from the labor codes in Lebanon. Even though like a few years ago, I think almost 10 years ago now, they did meet the legal criteria to form a union. It wasn't called the Migrant Domestic Workers Union because if you're not Lebanese, because the founders of a union have to be Lebanese in Lebanese law. So it couldn't be like a migrant domestic workers only. It had to be domestic workers. including migrants, but also including Lebanese. So they had met the legal criteria, and they wanted to apply, for approval by the state, because that's how it works legally, at least in Lebanon. And the state rejected it for no reason, legal reasons. I mean, there was no legal mandate for doing so because they had actually met the criteria. The two leaders were Lebanese, and so on. It doesn't matter in the law if other people in the union are not Lebanese. It just means that something along those lines. But that was like 10 years ago. So every year they have also on May Day, like on Labor Day, they have like a parade with all of the different colors of the different flags and like celebrations and whatnot. And some Lebanese participate to like as allies and stuff. I did when I was living there. And there are lots of different things that are, as I said already, like soup kitchens and like cultural centers and that sort of thing. But yes, like they are excluded from the labor codes, which is one of the reasons why the kafala system, because the kafala system is not a law that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as like the kafala law. It's just an informal system. Because they're excluded from the labor codes and therefore don't have these protections, this entire industry, because it's an industry in the end, developed. A bunch of Lebanese who would go to like Ethiopia and Sri Lanka and the Philippines, for example, and elsewhere, they would have local recruiters. Those recruiters go often to remote areas and to rural areas where people maybe have fewer tools to know that this is particularly bad or whatnot. And they are told, like, it's a bit like what happens with Dubai, for example. They are told you go to Lebanon and, they pay you this, and usually the price that they are told is inflated or a lie or whatnot. Once they get in Lebanon, it's almost like a trap. They often sign contracts in a language that they don't read because the contracts might be in Arabic, stuff like that. And they often come, as I said, I know for Ethiopia, for example, a lot of Ethiopians who go to Lebanon are from Tigray, the part of Ethiopia that even experienced a genocide at the hands of the Ethiopian state. They're like, they would be poorer, maybe more likely to be illiterate, not always, of course, but like more vulnerable in different ways. And that's why they tend to be preyed upon more. And they end up becoming like a good chunk of the percentage of the migrant population in Lebanon itself.
What would you say are some of the characteristics of the Lebanese ruling class or ruling classes or authorities?
So in some ways, it's like any ruling class in the sense that it's a land-owning class. And in the case of Lebanon, they also have like an armed component to reassert their power and so on. But what makes them kind of distinct is maybe like the sectarian element of it. So Lebanon is not just that you only have one ruling class. In a sense, you have multiple ones, but they tend to work with one another at times when, especially when the enemy is like, let's say, an independent party or an independent movement that wants to replace them. What tends to happen in that context is that the ruling classes unite. And for example, when there were the municipal elections in Beirut I'm going to get the date wrong, around 2016 or so, you had this kind of independent coalition of like just like teachers and like whatever, like people who are not like politically aligned to the dominant parties, and they were running on this platform, on this list, and running against them was effectively the entire state, like the entire ruling political parties, including those that are against one another in theory. They banded together to make sure that a bunch of like an architect and a film director and a teacher, whatever, like those guys don't get in power, because that's a much worse thing for them than having each other as the enemy. The ruling elites in Lebanon have sort of accepted, in a sense, the rules of the game that they themselves have created. That like, southern Lebanon, that's for Hezbollah and Amal. And Beirut, that's for these elites. And the north, it's for, or parts of it is for Hariri, like the Sunni elites. And parts of the mountains where I grew up is part of the Christian elites and stuff like that. It's always been much more convenient for them to deal with one another than it's been to deal with this potential third alternative. Because the third alternative, like, and maybe you can do some comparison, and comparisons are not perfect, but like with the Democrats and Republicans in America, that like if you have a third alternative that doesn't oppose the Democrats and the Republicans based on some kind of identity, like it's not that you are the Democrat and you are the Republican, but you are this third thing, and then it's about the issues that you support or whatever. In the case of Lebanon, it's a bit that, like, it's no longer about, if you're a third alternative, then your sectarian identity, let's say, is just not the one that you care about politically. You may still be Christian or Shia or Sunni or whatever, or atheist or stuff, but that's not what matters. What matters is that you want, I don't know, public services, or you want, I don't know, some kind of socialist program or whatever it might be. And whenever that has happened, the ruling classes in Lebanon have opted to band together to basically crush that potential. At the same time, the ruling classes in Lebanon have also been very interlinked with regional and global powers. There's a sizable Lebanese American diaspora. Not all, but a bunch of them are pretty right wing. Like, I don't know, Janine Pirro, I think was her name, one of the Fox News hosts in the George Bush era, is of Lebanese origins. You have stuff like that. And these people tend to be like aligned with the Republicans usually. And you also have like other examples here and there. Like in France, you have a Lebanese, not just Christian, but predominantly Christian kind of bourgeoisie that is sometimes liberal, maybe center left, and at times right wing. Like one of the figures of the far right in France, for example, is of Lebanese origins. In Australia, one of the figures of the right, I think technically right wing, not far right, I'm not entirely sure, is also of Lebanese origins. And those people, to some extent, to various extent, certainly in the case of France and America, Australia not so much, would also have like direct connection to Lebanese people in Lebanon. Like it's a more recent migration maybe. And so they would also influence the elites there. They overall maybe are richer than, let's say, your average Lebanese, so maybe they would have some kind of say in what's happening in Lebanon. That's where it gets kind of messier and more complicated, and these sorts of things end up happening as well.
How does anti or non-sectarian thought come up in resistance movements in Lebanon?
2019 was sort of the biggest one that we've seen, at least so far, that was explicitly anti-sectarian. The uprising at the time. There was one in 2015 that was also anti-sectarian, but it's almost like it didn't make that it wasn't its like priority. It wasn't the thing it was focusing on. Was in 2019 it was very explicit, and doing that meant that it allowed a lot of people. I was there at the time as well in October 2019 until January 2020, when essentially things started slowing down because of COVID, and then it kind of dying out by February 2020. It's one of the curses of the movement in a sense. It allowed a lot of people to, especially younger generations, I think, to start seeing what a Lebanon could look like beyond something called sectarianism at all. Like where this is just not part of the equation at all. Your religion or lack thereof is like a private matter and no longer something that the state has any say in. Let alone like them wielding power on behalf of Maronites or Shias or Sunnis or what have you. And that was a very rich space. Like it was, as someone who was there, like it was something that many people had never thought possible, myself included, really before. And that opened up a lot of potentials. Now, as I said, it was also crushed by there was a lot of repression by the government, including by Hezbollah at the time in 2019. What kind of killed it was just the COVID pandemic, especially in the early days when we didn't know what was happening. And then there was a Proto-Beirut explosion in August of 2020, which kind of further cemented the sense of despair in a sense, because by then you already had an economic crisis, one of the worst inflations in the world. The currency was devalued at like 95% or something. And a lot of people suddenly found themselves in like really, really tough economic conditions. Like it's more stable now with the war. It may no longer be, but for a period was stabilized. But what that meant is that a new unequal balance between people the haves and the have-nots was established. And instead of, I'm making up numbers here, but instead of like 60% of the population being below the poverty line before 2019, some 80+% became below the poverty line after the crisis, in a sense. That's not resolved. The tensions that brought 2019 in the first place, the contradictions, the problems, the inequalities, are all still with us in Lebanon, and in many ways worsened because of everything. And the war, obviously now the Israelis bombing entire parts of southern Lebanon. Even as we speak now, we've been talking roughly 2 hours. I have messages on my phone of like the different places they've been bombing. Like it's nonstop. This is obviously going to cause further economic crisis and other types of crises and tensions and stuff like that people in Lebanon who are progressively minded and whatnot will still try and deal with, and there's an entire new generation as well that was too young to be part of 2015 or even 2019 that may be part of something to come. We don't know, of course. It's very much of we will wait and see in a sense.
And what are these classes that you're offering now on Lebanon and their history? Can you explain some of those and what drove you to make these?
We're recording this on March 7th, and so as of next Saturday, March 14th, I'm gonna start it again. Registrations are still open for those who want, but 5 parts, 5 weeks, in which I go through, it's kind of an overview of modern Lebanese history and politics. So some of the stuff we talked about now, I talk about the elites, the ruling elites, what makes them kind of, well, unique in a certain way, but also like similar to other elites elsewhere. What's so special about sectarianism and why sectarianization is a more useful framework rather than just sectarianism. I talk about the regional dynamics. I talk about Hauntology is actually one of the sessions, like looking at Lebanon from the perspective of the disappeared, as you know, we kind of talked about here as well. All of that stuff. It's also open-ended in a sense that it's although I do have a structure of what I want to talk about, it's kind of designed to be very participatory for those who want, and just to make it more interesting rather than just me kind of speaking to an audience, to make it more interactive. And the hope with that, I already did it once and it's going to be the second time now. The hope with that is to dispel the myth that Lebanon is like unknowable, like incomprehensible, it cannot be understood because of ancestral hatreds or whatever, because it doesn't mean anything. It is complicated, yes, but it is not beyond the realm of comprehension, understanding, and at the very least having a good overview is very much feasible in 5 weeks, which is what we do.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on. Is there any last words you want to say?
No, not really. Thank you so much for doing this. It was very like engaging, and like you asked different questions from different angle of things, including like starting with personal stuff, which is always nice.
Yeah, thank you so much. Recommend everyone go check out the Fire of These Times and From the Periphery of Media as a whole, and gotta check out those classes. And so that I believe this will come out next Saturday. So when classes start, but
Classes start, yeah. But I'll be giving other classes later. So yeah.
That's what I'm banking on.
Amazing.
Hey listeners, The Dugout is all about sharing Black radical history and ideas to spark learning and action. If you've gained anything from these conversations, especially if you think we're cute, consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support helps us cover production costs, bringing on our amazing guests, getting Jordan all cozy before they smoke their little doobie before each episode, and beyond. Plus, you'll get early access to interviews and exclusive reading episodes. Head to patreon.com/thedugoutpod to join us and keep this work going.